Hey, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? This is your host,
Nico.
and Irvin, and this is Shining Spotlight, the stream where we highlight creatives in the industry in order to inspire you guys. Today, we have an extremely multi-gifted manga creator in our presence. She published many works such as The Dreaming in the early 2000s, written various different stories out there, and most recently, Fabled Kingdom, which is a work that she has out there now more recently. Some actually even give her the moniker of Australia's first internationally published manga artist. Today, we welcome one of the pioneers of the early OEL manga scene, the great Queenie Chan. Thank you so much for joining
Thank
us
you for
today.
coming on, Queenie Chan.
Hey, thank you for having me.
We're so happy to see you here today because obviously we have a lot of questions about things, and we just honestly want to just know more about your journey as like a manga creative. Like, would you mind like briefly just kind of just telling us a little bit about like, I guess, what made you get started on actually like creating manga? Like just kind of just a brief condensed version of that if you can.
Sure. Like my story is a little bit stereotypical. I grew up in Hong Kong and came to Australia when I was 6 years old, migrated with my family. And being a typical Asian family, they didn't really encourage me to draw or pursue any kind of artistic stuff because they think that, artists don't really make much money, which is true, unfortunately. And so they kind of encouraged me into other kinds of areas. So in high school, I didn't really draw very much except for school projects. Can't say I enjoyed the drawing process an awful lot as well, but I went into computing studies, and that was supposed to be my career. But apart from doing my regular studies, is that I also picked up a habit of reading manga back from Hong Kong. So even when I was a toddler, I was reading a lot of manga, and that habit didn't stop when I came to Australia. Would go to Chinatown and buy lots of manga, so I kept up with the latest releases that way. So I guess when I got into university, I didn't really enjoy it. The university didn't turn out the way I thought it would. So I struggled a little bit, and so my way of escaping from my studies was to start drawing manga. And strangely enough, it was specifically a manga called Rurouni Kenshin that was really popular back in the
Yep.
day. And I was reading volume 17 of that, and I remember that specific moment. It's like, you're reading a manga and like, hey, I could do this. I could like get a blank piece of paper and do some manga myself too. I don't know what it was that triggered that thought in my head, but that was how it started. And throughout university, I spent about 3 or 4 years. I think I took half a year off, so a bit longer than most for my information systems degree. I started to draw stuff as a way of stress relief and get away from what was happening. And I started making up my own stories. I've always had a lot of stories on my own. I would read stories and make stories up in my head, but never really tried to write it down or do it in manga. And when I started creating my own original stories, I started putting it online as well, because back then, because I was doing a information systems degree, I was online 24/7 anyway, because it was the early fledgling days of the internet. And I don't know whether you guys were on it, but like 1997, the internet was like 50% anime manga. Seriously, no joke. And so I actually, yeah, totally. And it's strange as it sounds, dial-up modem, it takes like an hour to load a JPEG, that kind of speed.
Exactly.
But it was clear to me that for me, my manga reading habits was a secret that I kept from my friends because I was the only one who was into it at my girls' school. And so for me, discovering the internet was like, there's all these like-minded people out there that I could share my work with. Yeah, so I would say that's how it all started. And I can't understate the importance of just discovering the internet in the early days of the internet and what it played on, my perception of myself and the things that I should like and so on. So that's how it all got started.
Okay, no, that was quite a bit. It's interesting. Like, I know you mentioned like, and I actually even read this like how a lot, your friends, back then, they weren't really like involved or like interested in manga, in the same way. So like, did anybody like encourage you like to kind of keep pushing? Like, I know your parents were very, like encouraging, at least from what I read. I don't know.
Really?
Oh, I'm wrong.
No, because I was so embarrassed about what I was doing. I was drawing
Mhm.
manga, but I kept it a secret. So my whole family knew something was going on. You know, they knew what I was doing. I mean, they kind of snuck it. I'm sure they snuck into my room and checked out what I was drawing, but we didn't really talk about it because it was clear to them that I wanted to keep it a secret. So it wasn't until I graduated in 2002, right in the middle of the dot-com bust, where I couldn't find a job as a programmer. And it looks like it wasn't going to happen on the horizon. My two other friends who graduated in the same year as I, everyone else graduated a bit earlier, they took 2 years to even find a job. So when I was just finished graduating, I was like, what do I even want to do with my life? I didn't enjoy my degree. It was in the middle of a complete bust industry. So I started looking for ways to get professionally published. And I can't say my parents were unsupportive during that time. They were probably more worried about my mental health. You know, they didn't know. It was clear that I was really depressed and I didn't know what I was going to do. There was no map. There was no roadmap. Like, how do you even get published? I mean, going to Japan was some kind of pipe dream. My Japanese isn't good enough. Like, it's not like you can just say, I'm going to go to Japan and you know, they're going to accept me. It's like, it's something that it's a dream you have in high school and in university afterwards. Reality hits and you realize that it's just a dream. So I had no idea what I was going to do. And that was, my parents supported me mentally during that time, even though they were still very skeptical about the whole drawing thing. They just wanted to make me feel better.
So I'm like, just, you know, for clarification. So like, were they more interested in basically going to like programming, that type of thing, since you used to be, you know, more like, you know, work like on programming and, you know, and that sort of thing. Like when you went to school, was that more of like what they were pushing for?
Well, not really for them. Because the thing is, I've always worked for the family business since I was a teenager because my parents don't speak great English. So I did a lot of the administration stuff for our company, and I still do, and I'm doing accounting stuff like that, a little bit of management. So I've always done that, and so they were probably thinking that if whatever it I was trying to do didn't work out, then I have some kind of backup plan that they could provide me. So, but they still want me to be happy, you know, and they were very skeptical about the whole, you know, publishing thing. Is like, well, who are you going to get published by? And that was the question mark. Is like Australia doesn't actually have any comics in its bookstores. At that time, America was being invaded by manga thanks to the efforts of Tokyo Pop, and that was doing very well. But that trend hadn't caught on in Australia. So if you go to a bookstore, it's like, what are you talking about? You know, except for Kinokuniya, which is a Japanese bookstore that we have one of in Sydney, and that's in the middle of the city. So people know about that, but that's kind of like it's not really a typical bookstore. The big chain bookstore in Australia still is Dymocks. You know, Dymocks still does not sell that many manga / comics. It's got like a section.
That's a greatness.
Yeah, it's 2022. You know, they should get into it. But the truth is that there's other discount bookstore chains that actually doing much better at selling comics than Dymocks is. I mean, when something is old school and set in its ways, and they don't have the money to make changes, and then that's it. They'll just cede the market to other people, and that's what the bookstore situation in Australia is like.
No, interesting. Now, before we kind of move into some of these other questions that we have here, just want to really quickly, of course, we have some comments that came through. So I just want to, you know, address them really quick. We have from Midnight Cross. Yay. Imaginos TV, great story.
Great story.
I was absolutely there in 97. And then we have from Jeff Lilly, you know, being based in Australia, how did you adapt to drawing everything upside down? Sorry, I couldn't resist. Australia is awesome.
Oh, thanks. I think we do everything upside down here. So adapting to drawing upside down is very easy.
Corny joke.
Midnight Cross, again, you know, as a fellow Australian, I really admire your story. Thanks for inspiring me.
Well, thanks very much. I would like to talk more about the manga scene in Australia where that's heading, even though it's very different to the rest of the world. I think Australia, unfortunately, is a bit behind in many ways, but you know, we've got a chance to talk about that later on and what I think should change. Yeah, we could do that if we have time.
And then we have from Ray Hama, peace, brothers. Hey, what's up, Ray Hama? Okay, all right, let's get back into everything, shall we? So I'm curious about, like, obviously the Dreaming, because that was the premier like book that you went with when you that you submitted with Tokyo Pop, you know, and obviously we have it right there. We can actually throw the art up on the screen as well. Here we go, so you can see it even clearer. So I'm curious, like, Did you already have that book like ready to go, and like they pretty much looked it over and said, "Yeah, we're gonna go with it"? Like, what was it like back then when you went, or did you just come up with it on the fly?
My story is a pure tragedy, even though it does have a happy ending. Because what happened was that Tokyo Pop at that time, I found a notice on the internet saying that they were, looking for international artists when I was just browsing the internet one day. And I was like, well, what's going on? It's like, I did some research and it says that manga is very popular in America. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? It's like, what, manga is popular? Like, what are you talking about? I was in Hong Kong at that time and just happened to see that notice. In my head kind of exploded, and they say, looking for anyone to submit. So I actually had different ideas at that time. I was looking to draw a shonen action fantasy kind of story, because I'm actually a big shonen fan. I'm big into Dragon Ball, Yu Yu Hakusho, those kind of stories. Not typical for what a girl to be, for not the kind of typical stuff for a girl to be into, but that's the kind of stuff I love, and I still love that. So I kind of came up with a story that's a kind of just based on a Chinese ghost story or something. And just an excuse to draw a lot of action and a lot of supernatural stuff. And so I submitted that to Tokyo Pop, and I had no idea what I was doing, because all I did was shove a bunch of, drawn pages into an envelope and sent it. And they came back to me and said, please submit a proper pitch next time. And I was like, oh, not that I knew what a proper pitch was, but apparently there was expectations. There are ways you do to, you have to do to get things properly submitted. So I did some more research and I began writing the pitch. An idea is like, this is what my story's about, this is what the characters are and themes and how long it's going to be, yada, yada. So I was rejected, okay, for my first submission. And then, because they blatantly told me, look, this is nice and all, but we're looking for an audience of teen girls, so if you could do something like that. So I went back to the drawing board and decided to write a story about a pair of twin sisters in a kind of romance setting in high school. Okay, and that was called, I think that was called Twin Side or something. I don't really remember. But I submitted again and they were like, nope, this is not what we're looking for. And I think I submitted one other thing. I don't really remember, but I was rejected 3 times before they felt sorry for me. And they finally said, look, why don't you draw a haunted school story and have some crusty psychic teacher or something like that. And so I was like, okay, I'll draw, haunted school story. And that became the Dreaming. So the twin sisters, that was from the romance thing that I submitted that got rejected, became the leads in this haunted school story. And that was how it all started. So it felt really unfair at the time, because I had a bunch of people that would hang out on a messaging board called Sudoma, I think, Sudomi or something like that. That was run by someone who was already working with Tokyo Pop as a manga artist. And so we all hang out there and we talk about submitting to Tokyo Pop. And everyone that I knew who submitted around about the same time as I did, they all got approved on their first go. I was the only one who got rejected, and I didn't get rejected twice or once. I got rejected 3 times. Eventually,
I'm sure that's probably hitting the core.
Yeah, it's like it makes you wonder, like, what did I do wrong? Like, is my art not good enough? Do I suck as a writer? It's like, what is wrong with me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a terrible experience to have for the first time, but actually a good one in retrospect, because if you get rejected the first time, you can learn from that process. And you learn from the whole pitching process. You learn to refine your ideas and pitch them better. And I think you get a little bit overconfident if you get accepted the first time as well. So I think mentally it was devastating at the time, but in the long run, it prepared me for what it was actually like to be pitching to creators and working in publishing, because working in any creative industry is absolutely full of rejection. And it's amazing that, people get rejected dozens of times. I mean, I just got rejected like 3 times, and that was devastating. But I guess my point was that other people got accepted right away and I didn't. Yeah, so that was my experience. And things did not go well from there as well, because I think maybe because I was Australian, and I guess Tokyo Pop being an American company tends to think of Australia as the Midwest of the Midwest of the English-speaking world. So if people just forget about you, or they think you're from some kind of backwater. And so I didn't even get my contract until 3 months after everyone else got theirs. And I was really worried. I just sat around waiting for my contract until I contacted the editor again, and they said, oh, we just completely forgot about you, sorry. And that's when I got my contract, because they forgot, and I had to remind them. And I wish I didn't wait 2 months, because I thought, oh, what's going on? Are they dropping me? Like, what's happening? Should have asked earlier. So that was another lesson learned. Sometimes you just got to not be so scared, I guess.
Oh, yeah, like the whole rejection. No, I get what you're saying. Like one thing about, I guess, rejection is, I mean, I even hear about like stories like with creatives where they've submitted things and they don't hear anything back at all. So at least if you're getting something back, it at least means that somebody thought you were worth looking at.
Yes, but I also have to say that that was at the time when Tokyopop wasn't being swamped by submissions. They just started out their call out. People didn't really know about it. So because I think I was probably a cut above some of the other artists that submitted to them. And so they wanted to keep me around because they were interested in commissioning something from me. It's just that, it's just my ideas is like, they don't love them or whatever. And so I would say that afterwards, from what I could tell from people who submitted a year or two after I did, is that they didn't get a reply because Tokyopop by then had a mountain of mail in their mail room that they had nobody to sort through it because there was just so many submissions coming through. So for me, I might have gotten rejected a number of times, but it was a matter of timing as well. I got my foot in the door early, and I think luck accounts for stuff like that. Luck and timing, a great deal.
Interesting. Now, before I jump back to these comments, because we've had a couple more comments come in actually. Mm-hmm. I do want to say for anybody watching, make sure you subscribe and like this video. Let's make this video blow up and go crazy. So go ahead and like this video, share this video around. Let's really bring in the questions, because this is an opportunity right now, people, to be able to learn from a legend. So with that being said, let's move on to the next question I see here in the comments. Imaginos TV, we'd like to call your iteration of the industry OEL 1.0. What types of things do you think OEL 2.0 should learn from you guys?
Well, that's a very, very long answer that I could give. I think one of the mistakes that, but anyway, I'll try and trim it down to as much as possible. I think one of the mistakes that the early OEL artists made is just pure desperation and ignorance of how the industry actually worked. And I don't want to say non-stop bad things about Tokyopop because they're not the first to come up with this kind of strategy, but they were what you might call an IP farm. And that kind of company structure comes straight out of Hollywood, and they're all about buying up intellectual properties and then putting it on their balance sheet and saying that this is how much our company is worth. And in these kind of situations is that these companies, even though they may produce books, is that they are not like traditional book publishers where they are interested in selling books. They're interested in selling the rights to some kind of big movie like Men in Black or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then making a fortune from that. And, that's their whole business model. And they make a lot of promises to artists who, particularly when you're young, is that you think that, several $1,000s is a lot of money. People like that, who are young and they don't really know how the business works and they haven't been in and out of the grinder, then they end up accepting contracts that they really shouldn't have. Like in my case, I think I had an idea of what Tokyopop was going for, but I didn't know the scope of it. So I had no idea that even after their company kind of shut it down, their publishing department, they would refuse to give the rights back, to that. But there's some good news on that later on, and I'll talk about that afterwards. Is that so my advice to the OEL 2 crowd is that if you look at what happened to a lot of the creators from the OEL, the first generation of creators, is that a lot of them signed all their rights away for literally peanuts. And in retrospect, I was lucky because I was just given a genre to work in. It's like, yeah, you go work in, do haunted school stories, like whatever. I didn't have any emotional attachment to this, as opposed to other people who was like, this is my story, the story I've always wanted to do, and they submitted and they got approved. And it's like, it's their baby, and then your baby is now being held hostage by some company who refuses to release your baby back even after they've shut down their publishing department. So in my case, I was lucky in that I didn't have any emotional investment, but other people, they were really, really devastated, and there was really very little that they could do to get the rights back. On the other hand, I did manage to get the rights to the Dreaming back, save for the streaming rights. And that's because a company in Australia, a new publisher, has decided that they want to publish a Dreaming, and so they negotiated with Tokyopop and they bought the rights back. Yeah, so that was an amazing thing that just happened recently.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so that's like party. But come on, learn from my story. That was in 2005. It's now 2022. Like, what does that tell you? It's like I do have emotional connection to the Dreaming. After all, you can't help but have one after working on it for 3 years, and the characters as well. The story isn't completely finished either, and I have to, rewrite some of it for it to be re-released again, which is what I'm currently doing. But that's probably what I'm saying, is that back then I took the contract knowing how bad it was, because I felt that at that point in time in my life, I had no options. No, there was no social media yet. It was 2005. I don't think Facebook's even appeared. YouTube hasn't appeared. TikTok obviously hasn't. So there was absolutely nothing.
Actually, I think 2005 YouTube did appear, but that was like the first year it appeared. Like that.
I heard heard about it later on from someone. I did workshop at a library, and some kid told me, "Hey, have you heard of this thing about YouTube?" And that's when I first heard of it. So for me, it was later than most people at that time, probably, because I was working. Once you're out of high school, suddenly you
that was before Google owned it, and it was more independent.
Yes. So nowadays, people have so many other options to get your name out there. Back then, we didn't even have these pirated manga sites where you can just go on and read free manga. We had to pirate manga off IRC chat. So you were in these chat channels where people would just there's a queue of 50 people trying to download 3 megabytes of manga, and you're like 51 in queue. That was what it was like to pirate manga back in the dial-up modem days. So the possibilities that I had was so limited, and again, Australia had no manga on the bookshelves, so I felt I had absolutely no choice at all to sign this thing for me to actually finally get a job, so I could actually tell people that I was employed in some way. I guess, even though being a manga, any kind of artist means that you're self-employed, particularly a manga or comics one. Yeah, so that was what I would like to tell people who are still interested in drawing Western manga, is that be very careful about what you get involved in when it comes to publishing contracts, because if you look at the first generation and what happened to them, you might never get yours back, to be honest, once you've signed it. And these people, they're not necessarily interested in making money off your manga either. It's just more about reselling their company at a higher value because they've got all this IP.
Yep.
At least that was a scam back then. Yeah.
Even now, I feel like people care about a lot about companies care a lot about IPs and everything. Everybody wants to build up an IP, and then somebody would hold it, if they can, because then you never know, later on they might be able to sell it. So
the standard's gotten a lot higher though, because too many scams of these have been pulled back into the early noughties and all that. Because some of these, if you don't exploit an IP, it makes no money. So that particular scam's kind of seen, has kind of run to the very end of what's possible. But it still happens, so to be careful.
I mean, going back to it, you mentioned, learn from how I did things before. And I mean, that brings us back to pretty much a lot of our other guests on here, where it kind of came back to, kind of the answers that OEL really is looking for, is to look at your history, here in the OEL community specifically. Look at how you all did it, and a lot of the other old heads, as far as basically, where they messed up and where to go with things. You mentioned you had no roadmap, when you started this, and that reminds me of a lot of folks that I seen that in the OEL community, and even ourselves to an extent, where you start this and you're like, well, I know how Japan does it, or I know how you probably look at YouTube videos and whatnot, but you're like, where do I go from here?
Yeah, exactly. Back then, I didn't know anything about copyright. That was the tragic thing, and there was nothing online about copyright or about how the publishing industry works. Nowadays, we have lots and lots of resources about how publishers work and how publishing industries work. And it's not fun to learn about these things, but I think it's necessary for me, because I've gone into self-publishing and I still work with publishers. And so I do kind of both. I work with publishers and I do self-publish my work. And so one thing that I feel is very important, if you're going to be one of these people who do both, or even just do self-publishing, is that you really need to understand copyright and how to use it. I can give some great examples of how ignorance can actually cost you stuff. And I was very lucky that to have someone point me in the right direction, so that I didn't lose out on what could be just something lucrative. Because if you're doing manga or any kind of creative work is that one way to make money is through licensing. And they can come in the most unexpected ways. So I'll give you an example of how my ignorance almost killed some good money that came to me. So I was doing a short story about the book that made me. So that was the theme of the book, and it was for charity. It was for an Indigenous literacy foundation in Australia. And so we were putting this book together by Australian creators, talking about which book it was that made them want to become a writer or a creator or whatever. So for that book, for me, it was actually Black Jack by Tezuka. So I wrote a story that was a mix of prose and comics, because that's something that I do as well. So I did a story based on that, and that was published as part of the book that made me. And because I wasn't paid anything for it, it was charity, so it was sent to various places and yada yada. And randomly one day, because I wasn't paid for the story, so I own the rights to the story. So the publisher Allen and Unwin came to me and they said that this big educational publisher in the US wants to use your story. I don't remember what it was called, Blackjack. Let's just call it Blackjack story. Wanted to use the rights of Blackjack story for their testing, the standardized English testing. Now, I didn't really understand what they were saying, because apparently America has these big company that does standardized testing and stuff of all these subjects. And this company wanted to use my story. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds nice medication. I'll just use it. Okay, that's what I just sent an email. Mm-hmm. And the Allen and Unwin lady said, look, don't do this. What you should say is that you want $400, okay, for them to use your story for 5 years. Now that's licensing, right? Mm-hmm. Is that they have the rights to your story for 5 years, and in return they give you $400, and you sign a contract talking about what parts of the story they want to use. If they don't want to use all of it, just certain parts of it, and you said so in the contract that I later signed. It's like, we don't want to use this section and that section, so I just sent the stuff to them. But I was like, oh, so that's what it means by making money by doing nothing. But what licensing is that you have, you have this thing that you could license to other people, and you've got to be very careful about the kind of license it is, because it is a right to secondary reprint license, meaning that there's a right of first reprint, which is what you use in magazines, like the publisher that has the right to print, to be the first person to print this story and make it known to the world. That's got a right of first reprint, and it's quite valuable sometimes. The entire Japanese publishing industry works on the right to work first reprint. Okay, you see these page payments for in manga, that's what they're actually for. They're actually not for you to produce the manga, they're for the right to be the first to republish your manga. Okay, so for me, that was a right of secondary imprint and worth a lot less thanks to the internet, because publishing on the internet counts as publishing as well. So if you publish on the internet, then your right to first reprint is pretty much gone, and everything after that is right to secondary reprint. So what I did was that I thanked the Allen and Unwin representative, and I took their idea and I went to the educational publisher and I said, okay, I want 5 years, $400. And they said, I don't want to do the 5 years thing. How about I just buy it for lifetime and I just pay you $2,000? And I was like, yes, okay, that works, since it's a one-off thing anyway. And this is the kind of story that very few people would find very few avenues for publishing anyway. So that was how I just got $2,000, just based on understanding what licensing is.
Passive income.
So that's what I mean when I say you need to understand copyright and licensing if you're going to be a manga creator, because if you're in the English-speaking world and you do manga, that travels really well. There's a lot of book publishers out there who cannot afford to produce their own manga in their own foreign countries, so they like to buy the rights to the manga from other countries, and they pay you, for work that you've already done, because they do all the translations and the marketing, and they just want to make money off your work. So for like the Dreaming had multiple foreign editions, but that was all done by Tokyo Pop. But these publishers, you can talk with them, and if they're interested in your work, then you could just approach them sometimes and say, I've done this and this. So because Fabled Kingdom, this fairy tale inspired story, has an
image on the screen.
Yep, that's from book 3. So Fabled Kingdom has a Czech edition. So this is from the Czech Republic, and it's a hardcover for some reason. So I was paid a fair amount of money. They did all the translation, which is actually a lot because it's a mix of prose and comics. Yeah. So I got some money based on that from something that I've always done. And the good thing about Fabled Kingdom is that I own all the rights to that completely. So I could actually approach other publishers that are non-English speaking and ask whether they're interested or not. In this case, I was approached by the Czech publisher. But
Oh,
here's
nice.
another example of licensing and how if you're a manga artist and you create manga, you could shop it around to international publishers and see whether they're interested. Because if they don't, because it's very expensive to create manga, and if it's already been created, then yeah, some of them might be interested.
So
Based
how
on
do you
that.
how do you suggest that people who are wanting to know more about like, licensing and stuff, like let's say I'm just like I'm only an artist or I'm only a writer and I'm just like I really don't even want to invest the time into really like having to do all this types of research. Can you point me in one particular place that kind of can teach me what I need to know to protect myself, and to understand licensing? Like, do you have any recommendations?
There are a lot of YouTube videos, that teach you the basics. Like I'm not like first of all, I'm not giving legal advice because I'm not a lawyer.
Oh yeah,
So
of course.
someone who is not a lawyer cannot give legal advice. But there are so many other online tutors and online websites and online websites for free that teach you on YouTube and stuff about these basics. Because what I'm talking about is nothing complicated. You're not going to be an intellectual property lawyer. It's not that. Okay. But you need to know the basics. And there are good books that teach you how to think of your IP. And one metaphor that people like to use is that your property is a bundle of sticks. Each stick represents a certain kind of spin-off property. Maybe this is the rights to the ebooks, and this is the rights to the print book, and all that. A single book can be spun off in multiple ways. For example, with the Fabled Kingdom book, that was the checked version, that was for print only. The contract itself specifically said it didn't do ebooks. If they wanted to do ebooks, that would be a separate contract, right? But most people don't realize that is that print books and ebooks can be spun off as separate contracts. But people don't realize that because most publishers, when they ask you for the rights, they would go, oh, print and ebooks and all languages for the rest of the universe, in Pluto. They could actually say that in their contract. And you could actually push back and say, well, no, I'm going to, print books only, or you can negotiate. Okay, it depends on who they are, though. The bigger the publisher, the less they're willing to negotiate with someone who's small. But I think there's plenty to be said for smaller publishers these days. You don't always have to go with the HarperCollins, the Random House of Shrewsbury. You don't have to go with that. Smaller publishers are a lot easier to work with. And if you build a good relationship with them, you can get far. But you got to make sure that they're actual proper publishers. Okay, in that there's a lot of scams in this area. A lot of people who have no experience publishing anything at all, and then they want this, like, I want to publish your book. It's like, yeah, but who are you? What is your track record?
Exactly.
How long have you existed? You've existed for like 5 months. Is like, that's a bit, you don't know how well these people manage.
Yeah, you don't understand the industry, at that point.
Yeah, you do want someone who's been publishing for a while. For the Dreaming, the publisher that brought the Dreaming back, they're a new publisher, but they're an imprint of an existing one. So this particular company has been independently publishing horror anthologies and books for quite a long time, and they're prose fiction publishers. So they have a distributor. They distribute their work internationally. They're a small publisher, but if you run well, these exist a fair amount. And so I want to point out that the Dreaming actually landed itself a pretty good home, because apart from it having a larger imprint that's been ongoing for many years, it's also a genre imprint. So that's something to think about when you are looking for a publisher, is that publishers who just say, I'm going to publish comics, rarely do well, in my opinion. And from what I've seen in the past 15, 20 years, is that if you want to be a publisher, you're better off. You can publish comics or prose or whatever it is, but you're better off choosing a genre that has been around for a very long time. Now, romance is one of the other popular ones, obviously. That sells like hotcakes, romance. Horror is another one that is very specific, and there's an audience for it. Fantasy is a bit broad. You might have to be clear about what kind of fantasy is that you're doing. There's detective fiction, crime fiction, mystery. I think that would probably be a better genre to market your book in. So these are some of the things you want to think about when you are creating your own work, is that does it fit into a particular genre, and how easy it is, because to market a genre, because some genres are very easy to market and there is an existing audience for it, others less so.
When I think of horror, I instantly usually think of Junji Ito, and I see how many collections, for example, over here in the States, we have Viz Media, and they publish
a zillion Junji Ito books.
Yeah, and it's all these different collections that they have. So it's pretty much all these stories, these short stories that he has, and they can kind of put it out, and it's repackage it or whatever, So when you're saying that, it just makes me think of that.
Yeah, Junji Ito, in my opinion, Junji Ito, he's a little bit overexposed in the West when it comes to a Japanese horror creator. I mean, the Dreaming is horror. That is what is classified as. It's actually Lovecraftian horror. So that's a guy with a long following. I know I know a lot of people may not know who Lovecraft is, but he does have an established
H.P.
following.
Lovecraft.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, he does have it was Lovecraftian inspired, and he was also inspired by an Australian story called Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is actually very famous. And so Picnic at Hanging Rock has been around for over a century. So it's a story about a bunch of schoolgirls who disappeared in the Australian bush at the turn of the century, about 1900, something like that. And it's a very famous Australian story because when the book came out, it wasn't exactly clear whether it was a true story or not. You know, so the author kind of played that up, and people were like, "Oh, you know," so it became something like cottage industry in Australia. So Australians most definitely would have heard about Picnic at Hanging Rock. So this is like the Dreaming manages to be an Australian themed story, which got it into schools and things, which otherwise it wouldn't be, because otherwise it would be a straightforward ghost story. So having an Australian component means that it manages to get into the education department, and there are funds, film funds in Australia that is like, if you're doing a movie that is Australian, you know what, hashtag Australia, who knows what that means, but Picking the Hanging Rock is or something like a Crocodile Dundee, you know, that is unabashedly Australian, then you might get better funding. So that's why there is some interest in schools and amongst the film industry in this story, because it's considered Australian, and that means automatic government funding. Now, the thing about the Dreaming is that that is something that could be leveraged if you're doing a creative own work. But of course, in terms of the horror component that we were talking about, the Dreaming has an advantage, is that it is horror, but it's nothing like most Japanese horror. And that was something that I factored in when I created the Dreaming, is that it's a very feminine story. It's got a lot of flowing dresses, because I like to draw ball gowns and everyone likes to look at ball gowns. And it was very European. And that's exactly the sort of ghost story that would not exist in Japanese manga. There is like no way like something like that would make sense in the Japanese manga industry. And I've read a lot of Japanese horror manga, and they kind of come into, you know, there's Junji Ito and then there's ghost stories, you know, so this is something that's very different to traditional Japanese manga.
So that actually brings up a good question. So when I think of like actually, what is your opinion on current OEL? I want to make sure, like, the current day, like the new creators that are coming out, before I even ask.
Before we jump to another subject, sticking with this current one, your story in particular, you said it's a happy in between middle, or so is it? I'm just kind of curious when it comes to horror stories. You know, there's a fine line between you know, what's great and what's kind of just like, all right, you're using the tropes a lot. I mean, are we talking a bunch of jump scares, or are we talking drift?
Well, when it comes to books, I don't when it comes to manga, at the very least, or the Dreaming, I don't go for jump scares, because I think jump scares work in movies, and everyone hates them anyway these days. If you're a horror fan, then you probably think jump scares are the most annoying things in the world. I certainly do.
That is me personally, yes.
Yeah, so I don't approve of jump scares in movies, but that's a film problem. For me, when it comes to writing manga, I don't rely on disgusting scenes. I mean, there is a place for that kind of thing. What's the Japanese might call guro, you know, where you have blood and guts everywhere, and there's a tradition of that in Japan. But I don't go for that. I go for more psychological horror, you know, that feeling of dread or atmosphere. Of, you know, the whole English ghost story, when it's there's a lot of fog, and then there's a lot of woods, and then there's a lot of something down the end of the hole, that kind of feeling. And I think that works better for what it does, because the Dreaming, I don't find the Dreaming particularly scary. It's meant to be, you know, more dark. It's more like dark fantasy, if you ask me, but I call it horror because that's how most people, it was originally marketed as something dark, you know. So that kind of horror, I think, has the chance to find a wider audience, because when you think about schools, they don't like it if you splatter intestines all over the panels, right? You know, right. Schools are going to look at it and say, you know, I think all this, you know, boobs and all this, you know, intestines flying is not good for the kids. And so because the Dreaming had so little blood in it, that probably helped it get into schools, because schools do care about such things. And not just schools, the average reader, if they pick something up and it's like too gory, it's probably not their thing, right? This is more like a more traditional kind of mystery kind of horror story, where you're trying to solve the mystery of the vanishing schoolgirls. Like the original Picnic at Hanging Rock, part of the reason why it became so popular was that it was about someone vanishing. We don't know what happened, and then there's a big question mark. So there's terror to be found in that, but it's not kind of traditional kind of horror movies where there's a slasher or something like that. Of course, movie horror is its own thing. But I don't know if you've seen a movie called The Vanishing. That's the European one. There was a Hollywood remake which sucked. Yeah, but there was a movie called The Vanishing, and it was about I don't want to spoil it. If you look it up, I think it was from Denmark or something like that. But that movie, had no violence, chilled everyone to the book core about what happened, in that story.
Sometimes
so definitely worth watching.
Creepy feel can do it.
Yeah, that's enough, for a lot of people. Sometimes people just like to read dark stories; it doesn't have to scare them. Yeah. So horror, I think, as a genre, has a huge leeway, for people to play with. And if you're talking about aficionados of the genre, and I am a horror aficionado, I do not know a fair amount of it. If you want to write in horror, you need to be familiar with a lot of these kind of genre conventions and the history of it, like, stuff like Lovecraft. He always has fans. So the people with expectations about what, the lore and all that in his stories. So you have to know that to be able to write in that area and have people recognize it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Taking it back to the question you presented before, Evan. How do you view the OEL audiences?
Sorry, got completely off track.
Oh no, that's fine.
I actually don't know that much about it. I'm actually really interested in it because on Facebook I see there are groups of people who are doing their own manga, but I don't know where to find it unless you're talking about webtoons. I know a lot of people on webtoons. I assume some of it can be considered OEL manga, but I'm actually not so sure because the format of webtoons is, I read a lot of webtoons. I'm doing a PhD that's partly on digital comics. And so webtoons is part of that. But I look at the webtoon format where it just scrolls down the page and all that. And I wonder, I think sometimes I see very interesting experimentations there, but I also think it loses something without the page format. But that's just my opinion. So as far as
they went with more of a manhwa approach with it, if I'm not mistaken. That's why it's kind of more longer, because it's more made for like cell phones. I think is the reason why they set it up that way for webtoons.
Yes, absolutely. I could go on a lot because I did, like I said, I did a PhD on it. I am doing a PhD on that. But as for why that happens, but there's a lot of manhwa who are in traditional printed book format as well. So it actually transitioned to that manhwa industry from the 90s, transitioned into that vertical scrolling format. And I don't think it's kind of improved the reading experience, if you ask me. But it is a specific thing that people associate with webtoons these days. Good, bad, I don't know, but that's the extent of the OEL I've seen. I do wonder how these people make money though, because while you have Patreon and if you manage to get into their, webtoon original thing, then you get paid something. But my understanding is that these deals are the, new equivalent of the Tokyo Pop deal, in that if you manage to get into the webtoon original, it's going to be like a 360-degree deal like they have in music, where if you're Beyonce, then whoever bought you owns everything about you, including your name, Beyonce. I'm assuming it's one of those deals. So
yeah, they did produce a few manhwa series. What was it, through Crunchyroll? I think there was with God of High School.
Tower of God.
Yeah, Tower of God. That was the other one.
The new Solo Leveling. Like, I think these are chosen by popularity, which I don't think is always a good thing. Because with manga, you can always calculate how many books that it's sold, and that's a very, very straightforward way of figuring out how many people would pay money to see something. Whereas if you're talking about webtoons, a view is just a view. Could be botted, it could be someone who doesn't care, So I think the way that people measure metrics on platforms like webtoons are a little misguided sometimes, because just because I gave you an eyeball for 10 seconds doesn't mean that I would ever pay money for anything that is related to your comic or your webtoon in this case. And so I have not been impressed by the quality of the webtoons that got adaptations. I'm being a bit mean here, but the truth is I read all of them and I'm just like, I don't see it.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because and this isn't, I want to make sure I say for anybody who has their stuff on webtoons, I'm not shaming about it, because there's a lot of great work on webtoons.
There is. There's a lot of good stuff.
I gotta give Ro Higashi a big shout out. Half of the Crown she has on webtoons. Make sure you check it out. Just got to throw that out there. But in any case, when it comes to webtoons or not webtoons, when it comes to current day OEL, do you think that maybe there's a lack of because obviously you haven't looked at a lot of it, but at least with webtoons, do you think there's maybe a lack of maybe diversity in terms of the type of content that people write? Because you mentioned horror, and some other genres before that, people can use to try to, push. But a lot of people seem to be always coming out with just fantasy stories nowadays, at least from what we see. So I don't know. What do you think?
I remember, because I have to read a number of academic articles on webtoons, and there isn't many, to be honest. Now, there's a whole kettle of fish about comic studies in the academia. But I read the article from someone who studied webtoons, and in a mathematical sense, meaning that they got a bot to drag through all the webtoons and divide everything up into genre tags. And it was very clear to me, from the moment you look at that graph, it's like romance is by far the biggest, most dominant genre on webtoons. I have a feeling that up to 80% of the site is something like female readers and a particular kind of female reader. Now, romance being popular is no surprise. I mean, the entire publishing industry would collapse if it weren't for the romance category. But my point is that if you want to stand out on webtoons, you understand the audience is mostly young women looking for romance or BL. So if you want to stand out, I think horror is actually one good way to stand out, because that is one of the least popular genres on webtoons. But you are always going to have horror readers on that site. And if you are able to do something that's a bit of a, has some kind of strong opening or some kind of strong premise, you could really stand out. Sweet Home did. That got a Netflix adaptation. So at any point in time, there's always someone who probably will do a punch-out horror story that will really, really stand out. But you have to be careful how you do it, I guess. And fantasy probably is also, like, if you're talking about fantasy, because I said before, fantasy is a very broad genre, and that is one of the problems, is that fantasy is not a genre so much as it is a setting. If you talk about romance, that's a genre. Romance, fantasy, that's everything. That's pretty much everything on webtoons. It's romance fantasy. Traditional swords and sorcery fantasy, you might have to be clear if you're going to clarify what kind of fantasy. If you're talking about mythological fantasy, now that's something. Now, is that adventure though? So that's why I'm not fond of the genre tag of fantasy, because it is a setting. And same for sci-fi. Like, sci-fi is probably one of the worst selling categories in fiction. Not because people don't like the setting. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a sci-fi setting. Like it's fantasy setting, it's also a setting. But my favorite form of sci-fi fiction is hard sci-fi. So very, very scientific, properly researched, science-y sci-fi, like real sci-fi. And that is the one that gets the lowest readers. So sci-fi as a genre, again, it's as a setting, again, may not be that great. And that's why I argue that romance and horror are some of the easiest genres to kind of put your stuff in, because in some ways they're diametrically opposed, and readers have certain expectations from it. So I think that if you are going to do something, that is standing out on webtoons, choosing a genre that nobody is publishing in, it may be a good strategy. Of course, I can't really guarantee anything. But I also think that a horror on webtoons, because it's a format that's formatted towards shorter stories. I think short horror stories, a bunch of short horror stories might actually be the best way to go on webtoons if you want to get some traction out of it. Because it is hard to sustain an ongoing kind of a series that's based on a serialized format in the way that webtoons is. You can do an ongoing series based on that format, but the trouble with that is that when people read stuff in that format, they'll expect a jump scare every episode. And if you can't deliver, your audience would kind of dribble away. So, that could be worth a try, a series of short stories and horror on webtoons. Because if you're going to even try, doing romance, it's like you're going to get swamped. In just like 10 seconds, you're going to get like completely swamped by all these other people doing the same thing.
So yeah, it's so oversaturated with romance and so many different facets. And for good reason. I mean, you look at the real world dynamics. Kind of the number one topic on everybody's mind is, kind of dating scene, relationship scene, or how it works in, a lot in politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But there's a lot of Japanese. The thing is, the Japanese market is segmented in such a different way. There's a lot of romance for men in Japan as well, and they do perfectly fine. But that's because they are published in magazines that have where readers have certain expectations. Webtoons, it completely lacks any kind of editorial hand. It's just like, if you're talking about the canvas aspect, it's just all fling it up there and let it just live or die based on its own merits. And sometimes things take off and sometimes they don't. Really, really good webtoons get overlooked by things that I think are completely mediocre. That happens in, Japanese manga as well. But you could tell that there's not much editing involved in a lot of these webtoon creations. It just makes the reading experience kind of blah, to be honest.
So I kind of want to let me center things back, kind of more, make it a little bit more personal. I'm wanting to know,
Sure.
like, from your experience, creatively, do you find that it's more, that you're more successful maybe through, like obviously having international publication, or, also, and I'm making a big assumption here, but I assume that you go to a lot of conventions because you guest a lot. You're asked to be a special guest quite a bit. So do you find that there's more success, like as a creative, of doing that, or being internationally published and like having your books everywhere, or do you find it's more of a or even having your work online? Like, what do you think is like the most? What, if you get where I'm getting at?
Yeah. How do you position yourself amongst these three vectors, I guess? I would say they all feed into each other. I wouldn't be where I am with the convention guesting thing if it weren't for being internationally published with the Dreaming. It's been, I don't know, 15, 20, 17, let's say 20 years, and I'm still riding on the coattails of the Dreaming. And it's embarrassing when you think about it, but that's the truth of what happened. Is like the Dreaming is actually still selling these days. Which is why the publishers want to bring it back, because it is still selling. And I was like, I'm actually really grateful for people who
I don't see that at all as like anything embarrassing. That to me is amazing. That's like,
yeah, well, I am amazed too.
That means you have a memorable work, which,
yeah. And in that, Tokyo Pop didn't even publicize it, didn't even advertise the Dreaming. So whatever it did on its own. And it's still a bestseller in Turkey, would you believe? It was a bestseller in Turkey back then. But that kind of created a launch pad by which I could kind of go to a lot of conventions as a guest. And I think being an artist really helps that. I think conventions want to see artists rather than writers. And so, when it comes to who gets to be a guest at conventions, there is actually a very limited number of people you can choose from, because I'm one of the very few writer artists out there who is a woman, because we do need some representation, and an Asian, apart from all the white guys. It's like recently I was at I don't remember which convention, but we took a picture of all the guest artists there, and it's like, wow, what a sausage fest, and a very, very white sausage fest as well. So I was like, am I the only woman who is also a person of color at this convention? Unfortunately, yeah. So I would say that the representation issue has actually gotten worse over the years. So that kind of frightens me a little bit, because it means that very few younger people are entering this, or if they're entering it, they have nowhere to make a platform for themselves. Like, how do you get your name out there? And it is a struggle. And I'm not sure really why that is, because there has been some successful creators in Australia. It's just that I don't really hear about them from the same channels. And I wonder if it's because sometimes people put a little bit too much stock in being internationally published. Because the thing about the Dreaming, despite it being still a bestseller in Turkey, and I got a book tour in Turkey back in 2009, it also got published in a number of countries that apparently sank like a rock. I did get a lot of fan mail from Iceland for some reason, but I know that it's been published in France, never heard about it from again. In Russia, in Germany, in Italy, Spain, like all these places got it, and Finland. But the truth is that a lot of it sank without a trace. And I think that's the problem with being the idea of being internationally published, is that a publisher is going to put down your book there, hoping it sells. If it doesn't sell, it's going to sink like a rock. And there is you're not going to get famous from that. Maybe you got some money, but to think that represents anything more than just another momentary kind of a passive income stream would be a mistake. You have to keep rolling as a creator, coming up with new things, new ideas, things like that. I mean, the Dreaming, I'd like to continue it because I have a good story, a good side story I want to write right after volume 3, So that's like motivation for me. But I've done other things since then that I think have been way more successful. Like I did a non-fiction biography series called Women Who Are Kings. So this is based on Hatshepsut. And it's very different what I normally do. It's back to color. And here we go. This is Queen Elizabeth the first. It's back to color, and it's non-fiction, and I do a lot of research on it because the middle one, Wu Zetian, about the female Chinese emperor, that was done for a master's degree at Macquarie University. And I did all this completely out of a personal passion, and it's not the sort of thing most manga readers would be into, or comic readers. And I just did it because I wanted the world to know about these women. But this thing, I've sold 2,000 copies of it just by sitting at a convention. you know, and by putting it online on Ingram Spark, which is a self-publishing platform where they, because Ingram's one of the world's largest book distributors, so I just slap it on there and just do nothing. And it sells on there too, with me doing no advertising. And I've done no advertising for this series except let people know that it exists or sit at conventions. And I'm like, you know, sometimes you hit on things that you really enjoy and that there is a market for. And that's exactly what sometimes people don't, like when people think, oh, you know, I'm always talking to comic creators at Comic Con thinking like, how do I sell more books, sell more books, sell more books? Like that is the number one concern of all comic creators out there. Well, I did this purely for fun, did not expect it to sell. I've sold a lot of books, you know, I did nothing. But this is exactly the sort of thing that most comic creators will never think of doing. And my friend looked at this and said, oh, you know, he really likes it. A lot of people do. Because it's properly researched and the story is enjoyable and all that. And it's short, you know, it's only 30 pages. And they say that, look, your book, these books, don't necessarily appeal to comic readers. You know, they appeal to normies. And that's why it sells so much compared to some of my other books. You know, it's not a fun reality to be had, you know, but that's the truth.
You're
sometimes
you don't kind of pulling new people in the comics.
Yeah, there is when you're different. If you're being different, it's like the same with Fabled Kingdom. It's a mix of prose and comics kind of format. I did no advertising. I've sold 1,000 copies of the whole series at $20 a pop. So assuming that I make $10, probably less of each book, that's still a fair, you know, $10,000 of just sitting around at cons doing nothing. And then just sometimes I think when you're different to other people, you do things that other people definitely would not do. You know, then you get some kind of audience that is actually very hard to pinpoint, but B seems to come out of the woodwork from all kinds of other places. And I have no idea what kind of people like to read this kind of stuff, but they exist out there and they exist in large numbers. You know, so it's a matter of trying to reach them. Like for stuff like Habshetsu, it's in school libraries, it's scholastic, you know, bordered because it's educational, obviously, compared to some of the more wilder stuff that people might get. You know, you might get in graphic novels. Is that some of these kinds of stories, even though no comic artist dream of, you know, doing this, it does manage to make money. You know, and that's something that I think people forget a lot. So a lot of people, when they create, particularly for the younger generation of mangaka, they want to emulate their idols. You know, they want to do I saw someone mention Jujutsu Kaisen, which I love Jujutsu Kaisen. You know, but it's probably not a good idea for you to do a Jujutsu Kaisen clone. You know, it does not make you unique. You probably won't find a market. That's the reality of the situation. Sometimes you might be able to find a better market and better audience if you just do something completely different that no one else would do. Yeah, the path's less traveled to reach undiscovered audience. I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. It's a very, very tough road to walk, though. Like I said, when I started walking it, I had no expectations. I was absolutely convinced that no one would be interested. Like I'm shocked that the, you know, Fabled Kingdom sold as much as it did, and I don't really try that hard to sell it either. People just come up and buy the book. You know, and same for the
you know, even with
series.
When I look at like even like, you know, your art style, how you're able to like, you know, change it up. You know, when I look at like how diverse it is or whatnot, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not only impressive, but it's one of those things to where I'm like, I don't know. Would you say that it's important for even like from an art standpoint for people to really have like a strong foundation, you know, to be able to really have
absolutely. The reason why I had to change out my art style was that people just tagged me as the mangaka, and that's all you can do. It's like this is all you can do. You're just a manga artist. You're unable to do anything else. And still, when you look at the art from the Women Who Were Kings, it's very definitely children's book inspired. It doesn't really. It has a few big eyes, but you know that happens in Tintin as well. You know it's not really inspired by manga art at all. But people still call me, oh, it's very manga. It's like how? You know, it's not really manga at all. But that's what happens when you are known for drawing in a particular style. Is that people slap a tag on you and that's it. You're stuck with it permanently. And this has been terrible because manga, when you're talking about as a publishing category, manga art sells really well, but Western manga art, because of Tokyo Pop, they've completely poisoned the well. And a lot of publishers, when they see that you're a Westerner doing manga art, they will just label you and just put you in a box and says that this person, we can't do this person because they do Western manga. And that's what Tokyo Pop did, is that they put out a lot of books too quickly. A lot of it was terrible, and it kind of made a lot of people think that people who draw manga in the West are a bunch of idiots who cannot, you know, put a straight line together. And that was a tag that I had to live with for so many years. And my reason for exploring different kinds of art styles was so in the hope that, you know, I could kind of get out from that manga tag. And that's why I tried drawing in so many different other styles and kind of teaching myself and how to make my art look different. But it's been something like 20 years, and I could tell you that I still can't lose the manga tag. So now I've come to accept it, and it's like, okay, fine, right? You could call I mean, you guys are clearly blind, but I'm not going to argue with you, okay? But I will, you know, continue like polishing my art and trying out different things, because at the end of the day, despite me being motivated by trying to shake off that manga tag, is like I've actually grown as an artist a lot because of my attempts to kind of shake off the manga tag, because it was so toxic. You know, but I've grown as an artist, and it's made me a better artist. So while my motivations weren't exactly, you know, self-improvement, now it actually turned out really, really well for me. I work for a Department of Education doing a series of magazines where they do children's book illustrations, and I do a fair amount of work for them at the time being. So that's an example of me. I don't do any manga style art there. I wish I had some to show you, but a lot of it's very children's cartoony kind of art style, and I've gotten used to drawing to that style as well. So suddenly I've got two styles that I could use under my wing. Like even though it's not what I wanted to do originally, but it's kind of only benefited me and broadened the kinds of clients that I can have when I do freelance illustration. So a lot of the time, people who contact me and ask me to do commissions, they specifically say we want manga. You know, so that tag will never go away. But that tag has actually been a burden when I try to work with traditional publishers, because they're like, oh, you know, and I'm like, no, this is manga. But it's like, oh, they see it's like the 1% rule. It's like the one drop rule, you know, and it's like you a little bit manga. It's like, yeah, you're manga. So that was how I was treated by a lot of traditional publishers, and that looks like it won't change. At least manga's selling really well now. So.
Interesting. Okay, you know, a lot to say there, you know, but I want to run through, because I know we're a little bit almost over our time. Actually, I want to run through these questions that we have here or comments from the comment section, and then we have two final questions that we would like to ask you.
Sure.
Actually, our two traditional questions. Let me see here. Where did we leave off? Imaginos TV 2.0 has some homework to do. I already crashed through that stained glass window. Just met someone who has Webtoon original deals today at Comic City Comic Con. See, preach on, Queenie Chan, about those views. Preach on. I agree with not being impressed by a lot of what I see in OEL these days.
Ouch.
Love that candor, Queenie Chan, for the win. That's really cool. Let's see here. Let's get through some more of these guys. I thought maybe we might have had a question or two in there, but I don't see one currently.
Yeah. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them.
Appreciate all the comments, guys. Now, before we move into these last two questions, guys, go ahead and give a thumbs up to this video if you're just coming in. Subscribe, of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel. You know, of course, we really enjoy you guys, and we have more interviews just like this one coming up. But let's move on to the final two questions. I don't know. Do you want to kick it off, Nico?
Yep. So who's your rival in the industry? Or do you have anyone that you were competitive with at any particular point in time?
No. Back from my Tokyo Pop days, there wasn't really anyone doing what I was doing, and everyone was actually too busy struggling with their schedules. So there was an artist who was a friend of mine, Svetlana, who has gone on to working with Yen Plus. So she's still working for Yen Plus, but most of what she's doing is kind of middle grade, the Babysitters Club kind of stuff. So I'm sure she's doing well for herself, but we haven't spoken for a while, and she's busy with a child now, so I'm not really sure what she's doing. But she's doing great, no professional jealousy there at all. But apart from that, people in Australia, my Svetlana, she lives in the US. She's originally from Canada. But in terms of Australia, there was someone who was working with Seven Seas. That was way back in the day, Madeline Rosca. So she draws really well. And she was actually very popular on Webtoons for a while as well. But I think she's kind of given birth to two kids as well. So she's kind of stepped back from Webtoons. She's no longer doing Webtoons as far as I know. And that was several years ago. So I'm not sure whether she's still doing comics in any way. I do still see her around on Twitter. But I'm friends with them too. I know a lot of people in the Australian scene. But rivals, someone who inspires me to do better, someone who's publishing the same avenue as I do, is like not really, because it is a lonely path. Because the path that I walk is so strange. Doing the comics prose thing, doing non-fiction biographies of famous queens, they've done really well with them, and now getting the Dreaming bag, yay! So still so excited about that. And it's like I don't know anyone who's walked a similar path. And while it's much easier to have a rival if you work in the traditional Japanese industry, and it would be nice to have someone like that, even then you wonder, it's one thing to have a dream of someone that can inspire you to push yourself to do better, and you compare and contrast yourself. But I guess things are different for Western manga artists.
It's funny, like whenever we ask that question, it's always like a very, like, some people will say like rival. And there's some people will say, yeah, I have a rival. It's like, oh, it's pretty cool, like to always hear like different contrasts with it, like what it means. So usually sometimes we frame it, and you already answered it, like even if it's not a rival, someone who empowers you essentially, where you kind of in a positive way motivate each other,
Yeah. But the things we do have grown so different. I've never done middle grade work before. I'm not interested. I don't think I'll be good at that. But yeah, well, whatever but that's her choice, to do that.
Interesting. Okay, not sure where N went, but I'll go ahead and kick this last question off anyway. So, of course, you've been a big pioneer in the industries, so far within your career. You've inspired many of us, across the world and everything that you've done. But just to take things a bit further, what is your end game? How do you want your whole career as a whole to be remembered? Like when you're old, basically, and you've kind of, you're at your end. What is your end game? What do you envision, your legacy to essentially be?
I've envisioned my end game in many, many ways, but so I'm just going to give it a go, and it probably won't end up like this. I find a lot of joy in doing series, like the Women Who Are Kings series. That was fun, and I like to continue doing work in that area because I really enjoy the research process and just the whole, making it happen. And the Dreaming, I think, because since I've gotten it back, gotten the Dreaming back, and I could continue the story in the way that I originally wanted it to. It's like I'm thinking, if this series seems to be proven, at least people seem to like it, I'd like to continue that universe and see where I go. But I've got to be careful about how I do it because, of course, I'm older now, and drawing manga is really backbreaking work. And so I've got to consider how I tell a story.
Just ask Yoshihiro Togashi.
Yeah, I haven't got, my back problems aren't at that stage yet, but I'm doing Pilates and stuff to make sure I never get that bad, and because it is a very, very real thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like to continue doing I haven't gone back to my original comics, just full on manga without any of the prose stuff, full on manga and doing a series. I haven't done that for years because I've done the nonfiction series is what I've been doing for the past few years. So I'd like to go back to writing that since I'm older and I think I've got better life experience. Just figuring out how to produce a story and just do something that give it a little bit of time that I will think is a good story. Because the thing about working with publishers and even with the Fabled Kingdom stuff is that I felt that I wasn't given enough time to create a story that I was happy with. And being a very impatient person, that probably played a role in that. So I would like to continue the series that I'm doing. And I think that, the Queen's Book and the Dreaming has already left a mark, at least in this country. Yeah, so I'd like to actually continue expanding that because there's money to be made there too.
Put it back over in the States. Bring it back.
Yeah,
over
I would like to do that. That's the publisher that I'm working with for the Dreaming has American distributors too. So that would probably come back.
Interesting. Okay, well, with that being said, what is aside from, of course, Fabled Kingdom, is there any other project that we should be on the lookout for? You just mentioned about obviously the Dreaming, but is there anything else that we should be on the lookout for coming up or coming out soon?
I'm working on the 4th book of The Women Who Are Kings, which is about Catherine the Great. And there's a list of women that I want to go through. It's only 8, about 8 of them in total, so it's not that long. But the Dreaming, I like to do a side story called Unicorn Skin. that's a kind of connected to the main story. But after the Dreaming is republished in book 3, I think that's when I'll get to work on the 4th book for that particular side story. And I think having a good self-contained story is a good thing for it to bridge onto the next part of the series, because the characters in that should actually appear in later on in the series as well. So I think that might be an interesting way to experiment with telling stories in this Brave New World, because right now with the Dreaming, that was done 15 years ago. The technology has changed a lot since then. I've started messing around with, laying the pages down for unicorn skin, and I'm using Clip Studio, and I have just noticed how fantastic some of the functions Clip Studio has. And I've been using it for years, but I think most people kind of stick with Clip Studio 101 without exploring its other functions. But I would say technology will probably make my life a lot easier, because there's brushes and then there's 3D modeling that you could use. And I actually I use 3D model backgrounds for Elizabeth as well. So the Elizabeth book, that was done, all of the backgrounds in the book, not all, most of them were actually 3D models, but you can't really tell. So I think technologies has gone a long way. So I think that would come, really, really help comic and manga production. And I've noticed that Clip Studio also has a convert tones and lines function if you go for the X version, the most expensive one, and they allow you to convert photos into black and white and tone versions. Now, I've tried that. Now, this is a kind of a wonky process, but I have noticed that they do that a lot in manga backgrounds, in that they actually merge photos together with hand-drawn art. And there's this particular way that you that you use to make it look well. And so that's what I'm hoping to do, is that as a way to alleviate the pain of drawing backgrounds. Yeah, so we're coming to that phase where a lot of technology can actually save a lot of people.
Okay.
And I think a Facebook users asked a question.
I was just going to say, actually, one last question for you. I'm like, how do you keep up your workload? What are your tips not to burn out?
I set a very simple goal for myself every single day. And I make sure I have one day of the week where I'm supposed to have one day of the week where I absolutely do no art. And I don't care what I do that day. It's just that I do not touch the drawing tablet whatsoever, like nothing. And I think that's usually a Sunday. But particularly if you work another job, you need to have one day where you do not think or work or touch anything that is art related, because that day is like when you have your peace of mind. So tips to not burn out. Everyone's different, of course. But managing your workload, setting yourself a reasonable goal every day. For example, I just have no time to draw Catherine the Great right now, because I'm just doing so much other work. But recently I set myself a goal, is that I draw a panel a day, for Catherine, whether it's fully finishing it, because the art is not that complicated, because I've laid out the entire story already. Yeah, so I kind of set myself, hey, so I'm going to do this many pages, this much a day, and then that's it. And I think one of the problems that people have when it comes to burning out is that they think of manga production as a sprint rather than a marathon. And so for most people, their problem is not that they can't sit down and draw for 3 days straight. That would kill you. Don't do it. Okay. Everyone who's tried it never got their work finished anyway. The problem is not your energy, the amount of energy or the amount of desire you have to get something finished. The problem is always people don't know how to run a marathon when it comes to creating manga. Is a marathon, when you think about what marathon, you're running slow. Okay. You'll have planned how you're going to do things all the way through. And it's going to go on for hours and hours. In manga terms, it's going to go on for weeks and weeks. And you're going to plan yourself and pace yourself properly. People who burn out are the ones who try to do too much, within a short amount of time. Okay, and this actually comes right back to things like conception of ideas and how you write your story. Like for me, I'm at the stage of writing where I write a story and I've just got an idea in my head, and if I put it down on paper, I pare everything down to the bone. Any scene that is not necessary to the plot or characterization gets the bin, no matter how much fun it is, to have these characters screwing around and having fun at any particular time. Oh, I really love this scene. It's so cute, but it's not necessary to the plot or story. It gets cut. Now that's how I write these days. And that's so I pare down a story right to the marrow, and that's when I decide that, and then I make the choice of whether I actually want to make this story or not. When you get to like my age, I'm not young anymore, let's face it, is that I just have a limited amount of time. So I can only do the ideas that I think are the absolute best. And 90% of my ideas are crap. You know, and I think when you're young and you're just starting out, you're so excited because you have so many stories. I've got 10, 12, 20 stories, all these stories I want to do. Is like, and they all seem really good. But what you need to do is to sit down, sort it out, write it down, think about it. What story is A, going to get you most excited? B, get your readers most excited. That's probably more important than getting you excited, because you're probably excited about everything you do. So what is the sort of story that will get your readers most excited? The kind of story that people would pay money to see. You know, the sort of stories that you could actually do a reasonable short story of and then extend it if you want to, because some stories you can do that, others you can't. You know, think about all these ideas and choose what is the A tier stories. And you would find that in a pot of about 100 stories, like maybe 1 or 2 will be A tier. And what you don't want to do, particularly if you don't want to burn out and then don't want to waste your time, is to not go for anything that is derivative. You know, do not do anything that if you look at it and think, oh, you know, this is popular, this genre is popular, I'm going to do that, or I'm going to do another Naruto or something like that. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. I think I'm just telling you to be original, and that's going to be ridiculously hard. Like, I know that's a very, very stupid advice because everyone wants to be original.
That word again.
Original.
Yeah.
Highlight.
But let's face it, if you don't have an original idea right now, you got to make sure you do a short story that has a great ending to build your reputation. Do not waste your time on your magnum opus that's going to be like 30 years in the making. You know, you're better off sticking to a short story that will build your reputation and have something finished so you could show someone, look, I finished a story, check it out, and it's like 50, 100 pages or something at most, and they're going to read it because it's short. No, they'll probably read it and think, oh, this person can write. You know, what's your next story going to be about? Because if you don't have that, you know, you see, if you don't have a finished story that is good to show someone, it's like, what's your proof that you can actually write? You know, and that's what a lot of young writers forget, is that, oh, I could, you know, do this ongoing story. I'm going to do my favorite manga. Is like, yeah, but when other people are going to look at it, they're going to see a manga that's unfinished. It's probably all over the place in its beginning chapters. You know, that would be most webtoons. And they're going to like, is the rest of it coming out? Oh, this is like not very focused. I'm like not really interested. That's actually the point where I stop reading a lot of webtoons. Is by chapter 8, you haven't told me what the main story is. The main thrust of the story is, I'm out. You know, and that's most people. You know, so if you look at the Dreaming, you know what the story is about by chapter 3. And if you don't, you're screwed up. You're messed up somewhere. You know, so that's something that I want to remind people is like always have something that's finished to show other people and make sure it's good, because then that's proof that you can actually write a decent story, at least one decent story. Because if your next one sucks, then that's a problem too. But that's one way to build a career, is like build a reputation. Yeah, because that's what keeps people from coming back. You know, they read a story of you, is like, oh, even if they don't like the story on how it ended, if it ended properly, then they're gonna say, oh, okay, you know, not my thing, but you know, I could see there's talent there. You know, if you've got your next work, you know, let me read it. And that's how people are these days. And it's like, if you're talking about stories, dime a dozen. I'll go on webtoons. There's a zillion, many of them unfinished, many of them unfocused in the beginning. These days, if you're going to write a story, you're going to make sure you grab the reader by the throat from chapter 1 on, and it kind of has to keep going, has to maintain that, you know, that level of you know, grabbing the throat right all along, because otherwise you're going to lose people's attention, and that's the reality. And good storytelling is meant to do that anyway. And one thing I also like to suggest as a way of practice is reading bad manga. Like Shonen Jump does this axe maneuver continuously, and there's a lot of YouTube videos that talks about Shonen Jump's axe maneuvers and who they axed. If you've got the Shonen Jump app, that's just $2.99 in Australia. It's cheaper in the US. It's like, go and read all those Shonen Jump cancelled manga, because I've read all of them, and I make it a point to read all of them, and I could see exactly why they got cancelled. You know, you got your favorite Jujutsu Kaisen, read that, and you could tell that it's not going to get cancelled quite early on. You read the other cancelled manga, and you're like, I could see why this got cancelled. Very often it's derivative. It's the story's all over the place. You know, the characters are bar. You know, the art. Well, art's usually good if it's Shonen Jump, but you can learn a lot from that process. And I do this because I feel I learn a lot from Shonen Jump and how they murder people, like murder their stories continuously, because within 10 chapters, if you've got no direction, I'm sorry, it's like your story's done. No, rare is it that you can get a story that can survive past that. Dr. Stone did, Undead Unluck did, but they're really, really exceptional cases. And like both of these manga turned out to be fantastic, but
they barely skated by. They
barely skated by. And Undead Unluck is just, it's getting finished. And Dr. Stone, I was surprised that I think they allowed Dr. Stone to go on for as long as it did, despite his sudden switch in story, was because of the artist. It was one of the really well drawn ones in Shonen Jump at that time, and there wasn't that many
Boichi
when it comes to art wise.
Yeah,
so that's the only reason, because anyone else would have axed it, given what it was.
Yeah,
like don't be afraid to do short stories and make sure they're good, because a short story, I have a collection of short stories that is way back from my 2010 days. It doesn't sell much at cons, but sometimes people, buy it and they say, oh, I kind of enjoyed your collection. They're all good stories with good endings. And they're like, oh, they come and check out my other stuff. That's how you get other people to check out the rest of your work. They buy one work, they like it. It's like, okay, this person can write. Then I'll read their longer works, invest more money. And if that's good too, then, you've got yourself a fan, maybe.
There you go. There you have it. Ladies, gentlemen, guys and girls, these and sirs, those are unique pronouns out there. Understand something. Queenie Chan here just dropped down so much advice and knowledge. We went ahead and let this show go on 20 minutes longer. Like, I hope y'all had your notebooks open and everything to know.
Please.
Watch this video like about 4 times and dissect a lot of what we just said here, because so much was highlighted in the OEO community, certain current time issues, certain stuff that you can take away from for basically helping you get out of a rut if you're in it, or helping you to actually progress. You don't know where to go, all the way back to where you can look to actually refine your craft, like you just said, Miss Queenie Chan. Look at the failed works in Shonen Jump. Oh,
Yeah.
that was
I
great.
got one.
That was great.
There was just one last question. What manga out right now should be cancelled or should be cancelled? That was my Facebook user. I'm just looking at what I'm reading in Shonen Jump, and I always read the new ones. I'm reading Super Smartphone right now, Ruri Dragon, and Aliens Area. That's the new ones I'm reading. I'm absolutely certain Super Smartphone is going to be cancelled. Okay, because Super Smartphone, if you read it, it lost me with the high-rise thing. It actually had an interesting chapter. But it got some kind of high-rise storyline in chapter 2 and 3, and it just lost me immediately. And I'm thinking, this is not going anywhere. Yeah, Ruri Dragon is a slice of life, so it's about a girl who actually is half dragon, and it's like, it's a cute story. We'll have to see where it goes. Aliens Area, it does not look great at the moment. It looks very Men in Black. It has the same concept. It's going to be a battle manga, and battle manga is very hard to stand out from the crowd these days, especially when you're up against Jujutsu Kaisen. So unless it does something really interesting with it, and it doesn't look right now all the characters look very, very battle shonen, tropey-esque sort of thing. Unless it does something really different I read up to chapter 3, so unless it does something really different in the upcoming chapters, then I think that it's not good. And because if you're talking about cancelled shonen manga, which I think was good, but I could see why they couldn't go on forever. Siren is a good example. It's like good stuff there, but just not unique enough. Whether it's in the setting or in the power system. Yeah, so I think you can learn a lot. Yeah, from reading cancelled Shonen Jump manga.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much again, for coming on and enlightening us today, and just talking about your journey. We really all appreciate your time today. Again, we know we're sitting, in front of a legend right now, so it's really appreciated. Very quickly, can you actually tell us where, anybody out there, you've shown us a lot of work. Where can we find these works? Where can we follow you? If for whatever reason I'm somebody where I'm like, I don't know where to find any of this stuff.
I'll just go to queeniechan.com. It's my website. Yeah, so queeniechan.com is good. I'm on social media. My social media is listed on my website. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I've abandoned some of the other stuff like DeviantArt, so just rely on the main 3. And you can find my books on Amazon as well, because the service that I use, Ingram Spark, to do my self-publishing, it distributes to Amazon. So you could just go on Amazon and search for Fabled Kingdom or the Queen's books, and you could just buy them off there.
And we're going to put those links down there too, guys. They're not there right now, but they'll be there after the stream. So you guys can, of course, go ahead and check it out. So you can go ahead and, of course, pick up the Dreaming when, of course, it's back out in print, and then also, any of the other copies, Fabled Kingdom, of course, look at that art. We can see, look at that art. Look how amazing it is. you know, and a great story. So make sure you go ahead and you pick up a copy of that. Also, for next week, our next guest, or actually not next week, 2 weeks from now, our next guest will be Tani Andrews. She's going to be coming on talking about Seeds of Doubt. That's her latest story coming out. So you'll want to make sure you guys go ahead and check out that interview that we got coming up. That's in 2 weeks, guys. And then, of course, you know, the next 2 weeks, we have our next episode after that as well, which that one I know you guys will also be excited for. With that being said, did you have anything else that you wanted to say in before we left?
Everyone, you know, let's enjoy the summer, and again, like Miss Queenie Chan was saying here, you know, really take a moment to reflect on you know, what's going on with the current OEL scene, where you can refine yourself and stay original.
Oh yeah. Also, this episode will be on Spotify in a couple weeks. So for those of you Spotify listeners out there, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel to also check out the videos when they're live. With that being said, thank you guys for watching. We'll see you later.
Catch y'all
Thank
later.
you.